All right. Why is this the order? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then Acts?
Because it is.
That's how we learned it.
Right.
What? Well, which one's the oldest? of
Mark.
those?
Mark is the oldest.
So why is it Mark first?
That's a good question. I've often wondered.
Have you? Because originally Matthew was thought to be
Oh.
the eldest, mainly because of the identity of Matthew and Matthew's relationship, well, with the others, but in particular John. Now, right as we were ending last time, we got to this curiosity known as Q. Anybody remember that? It was at the end. I had you fairly somnambulate by that time.
We've heard of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's from the German word Quelle, which means source.
Another source.
There are, yeah, well, I wouldn't be surprised Ian Fleming, good Anglican education. All right, there are things that one might find,
Yeah.
yes,
Yes.
in Matthew and Luke that you cannot find in Mark. Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And it indicates that there was a shared source somewhere along the line. That is Q, it's lost. But it's like, as I think I talked about on Sunday, and certainly I was talking about last night, when we read from 2 Corinthians, that's actually 3 Corinthians. It's 2 Corinthians because the real 2 Corinthians was lost somewhere. In the body of what we call 2 Corinthians, there's reference to my previous letter, and it doesn't match anything that's in 1 Corinthians. So obviously there was another letter. Apparently it was a fairly unpleasant letter, and so it got
Somebody burned it.
lost in the mail. I don't know.
Uh-huh.
It was like your eyeglasses.
Yeah.
Yeah, which went to Roxbury or someplace. I don't know where
The
they
bad endings.
Yeah, so Q is out there. We don't know what it is.
Probably the true.
We don't know what it is. It may have been a written source, but more likely it was what?
Oral.
Oral, yeah. It's part of the oral tradition. It was sort of a collection.
Does he have to separate you two?
We're making up the,
Right.
we're making up the canon.
So
Okay.
odds are it was a collection of oral stories. I'm sorry, Sandy. They're really. Sandy came here to learn something. The Episcopal schoolgirls are being silly. Yeah, so it's out there. It's floating about somewhere. It's a collection probably of stories in the oral tradition. But anyway, it is sort of significant. And I don't recall if I mentioned last time. I should have watched the video, but the things that are found in Q, which means they're found also in Matthew and Luke, but are not found in Mark, include, and this is how significant Q must have been, the Beatitudes were in Q. The parable of the wise and foolish builders, the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the wedding feast, the parable of the talents, the lilies of the field, right? That's from Q. And this is the one in particular, it's kind of interesting, the Lord's Prayer. So Q had a lot of significant stuff to it for a lost book, and who knows what else was included in it, but it is now included as part of Matthew and Luke. But that doesn't answer the question as to why Matthew was thought to be older. Yeah?
I'm just gonna posit a theory. Since he's the most Hebraic, I mean, the most,
Well, I think that's probably, yeah.
they maybe thought that was a good PR move with the Jews, you know, to put the most Judaic.
Sure. What's the difference between Matthew and, say, Mark and Luke?
The names.
Nice.
Ecclesia. He's the only one who uses ecclesia.
Yeah, something else though.
Mm,
He was the only one we know for sure was one of the 12.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. See, so
Yeah,
he
but-
would take, he would be thought to be an elder book because of that. Yeah. So, and also, he was Hebraic. It is unlikely that Matthew knew Greek. Now, he could have, but he would have known, for example, what did he do for a living?
Tax
All right, okay. So he would have known Hebrew, obviously, and he would have known Aramaic, which was the marketplace language. There was no reason he would have necessarily known Greek, and not certainly with the kind of literacy of whoever put together Matthew. Now, in the era before, the days before photocopiers and audio recorders and video recorders and all those things. If you were a person who had to keep records or were of some means, then there was a member of your household staff that was invaluable, and that would be
Scribe.
a scribe. Yeah, everybody had a scribe. You weren't anyone unless you had a scribe. That was actually a pretty big. There were official scribes, of course, for the temple, but there were official scribes, but for the court and for the temple. But there was a pretty lucrative market for individual scribes. The thing that's interesting about them, though, they tended to be multilingual and rather facile in their ability to use languages other than the one from whom they were taking dictation. So,
Yeah, they could read and write.
yeah, but also, I mean, they had to keep records for a vast audience and a whole collection of languages. Just think about the day of Pentecost and all the languages that they had to use, and not just marketplace language like Aramaic, but other things as well. And so and especially, again, the role of the scribe. I don't think anybody's ever really studied this deeply enough to kind of appreciate it, but imagine how much more important the scribe became as the Roman Empire grew. If you're Joseph of Arimathea, who would have been wealthy enough, or at least middle class enough to have a scribe, and you're doing business as far away as the British Isles, which he or at least members of his merchant class would have been doing, consider all the languages you would have had to work through. The Germanic dialects and whatever gibberish they were speaking in Britain, and what were they speaking in Gaul besides Latin?
Barbarian.
Yeah, what was that? There were dialects that eventually became French, but when they merged with Latin. But anyway, okay. So that was So Matthew probably did not speak Greek. He was one of the 12, and so he was given primacy. We do know he was a tax collector, and let's see, what else do we have here? We also know, well, in Capernaum, by the way, and the significance of Capernaum, of course, is
Peter's son.
yeah, that's the locus. Yeah, that's really the genesis point for all of this. This is
Where he started getting it.
yeah, Zebedee's boatyard, things like that. And I'm wondering if there would have been something like a custom house in Capernaum, and that's where Matthew worked. But he would have worked a lot with the fishermen and with those. As I think we'll discover on June 24th too, with Kim's sermon, we'll see how that port in that area was terribly important, not just commercially, but to the development of Christianity.
And a synagogue.
Yeah.
We saw it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not far from where they believe Peter's house is.
Okay.
But that's just.
Right down the street. Well,
It's not a big.
short commute.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There we
I'm still
go.
gonna jump.
Yeah. All right. So, his name, however, and this is interesting, which speaks on to the primacy of Matthew originally. His name was not attached to this gospel until the 2nd century. It's sort of like everybody knew that was produced by one of the 12, and so we don't have to put a label on it. But by the 2nd century, obviously, those early generations of Christians are going away. Jesus has not returned as quickly as people thought, and so their planning changes from day to day to, well, let's provide then for the next generation. And so this would have been a part of it. So Matthew's name gets added to the gospel. But do you recall I spoke of dates last time when Matthew's gospel would have been produced? Do you remember it all? That was like 4 or 5.
60, no, that was based on 70.
Let me look, because you know what?
Mark's first.
Mark's.
So it's like
old.
70 to 75?
Between 70 and 80 is the
Okay.
current thinking, all right? Between 70 and 80. So, all right, so that decade, we put circa 70. And that's CE, right? Which stands for
Common era.
Or Christian.
era, I hope.
Era.
Yeah, okay.
Era.
Not era. Yeah.
Common era.
CE and AD are the same dates, it doesn't really matter, but okay. So, good. Let's go to the earlier gospel, though. Mark would have been the decade before, all right? That's circa 60. And like Matthew and Luke, he's one of the synoptic gospels. Synoptic meaning through one eye, all right? They all share things. John is distinct. These three share some things and a particular vision, and along with Q, have that. Okay, so Mark. What do we know about Mark?
He writes a good outline.
Yeah. What else do we
He just does stories, right?
Yeah, it's the simplest of the Gospels, so simplest construction, yeah. And it also has a rather surprising ending.
He's a really good use of adjectives, too.
The green grass.
Oh, yeah. Yes. They knew it was a carrot because it was orange with a green top. Anybody watch Mr. Bean
No.
or Blackadder? You know that actor, Rowan Atkinson?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seen on BOAC.
He does an Anglican priest who reads an uncommon gospel, one of the new gospels, about Jesus as the magician. And then for them he produced a carrot. They knew it was a carrot as it was orange with a green top. It goes on from there. All right, anyway. So, all right, Mark, simple gospel, designed for a particular, if you remember last month, a particular audience, was probably a fellow by the name of John Mark. Does he ring a bell at all? John Mark. Probably not. John Mark was, this is what I get for having going to Soma Day. I'm completely out of it. All right, here we go. Talk among yourselves.
Just
We're trying to quiet us down.
Give them time, don't encourage them.
It worked.
Get us going.
All right, here we go.
Back to life.
This is from chapter 10 of Luke. After this, the Lord appointed 70 others, and sent them on ahead of him in pairs to every town and place where he himself intended to go. This is familiar to you, all right? He said to them, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go on your way. See, I am sending you out like lambs into the midst of wolves. Carry no purse, no bag, no sandals, and greet no one on the road. Whatever house you enter, first say, peace to this house. And if anyone is there who shares in peace, your peace will rest on that person. But if not, it will return to you. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whatever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. Yes, I would quote that to vestries. Do not move about from house to house. Whenever you enter a town and its people welcome you, eat what is set before you. Cure the sick who are there and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. But whenever you enter a town and they do not welcome you, go out into its streets and say, even the dust of your town that clings to our feet, we wipe off in protest against you. Jeez. Ouch.
Yeah.
How many people?
70.
All right. So we know of the 12, of course. We should know too then of the, this is useless, of the 70. They're rather important because within the body of the 70, we find John Mark. All right. He was one of the 70, apparently, according to Eusebius, the early church historian. So Mark was one of those. He was a companion of Simon Peter's. Herod Agrippa became king of the whole shebang, became king of Jerusalem, and started one of the earlier simple persecutions. The notion was just to round up most of these troublemakers. Peter was arrested. This is captured in Acts. Of course, Peter was arrested. Peter escaped. Along with those he met after his escape that helped him through this sort of underground railroad that they had for early Christians was John Mark, who stayed by his side and apparently had some talent as a scribe. And so the Gospel of Mark is likely to be the sermons, reminiscences, stories, what have you, the teachings that Peter recalled and that Peter presented as he went on his way throughout his ministry. So the most direct connection we have to the 12 isn't so much through Matthew as it is through Mark, because as you know, I mean, if there were a contest between Peter and Matthew as to who was more intimately present for some of the more seminal events with Jesus, it would be Peter. And so John Mark may very well have been a kind of scribe to him. Also, that makes sense, because was Peter likely illiterate?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he was, right. Had no, there was no reason for him to know how to read and write. Add, subtract, oh yeah, that he could do. He could weigh things. He could weigh things so successfully that it would actually weigh more. My grandfather used to
Always
go to
forget.
it's a butcher shop my grandfather used to go to. He used to always call the guy who weighed the meat, Thumb. Why is that, Grandpa? He said, because Thumb's on the scales. All right. So that's who Mark likely was. Just some other things that might be of interest to you. He eventually founded the Church of Alexandria in around the year 50 AD. So one of the things, and he became the first bishop of Alexandria, and you may recall from our Lenten classes that Alexandria was a place of terrible importance. Antioch and Alexandria were the twin poles of early Christianity when it was becoming intellectualized. And, you know, it became the place that was creating a library and a system of teaching and a network of, what would we call it now, human service organizations and all those things, right? That was all happening. So Mark actually established that. And around the time then, he's getting established as the first bishop of Alexandria and building that church up around him. That's when the gospel was being produced. So it's likely that this was then the first teaching tool of the Alexandrian tradition. I should point out too, you know, there are 3 orders of ministry, right? You know that? The primary one being, as they will tell you, bishops, right? Then priests, right? Then deacons. It's in the prayer book. All the ordinations, sacred order of deacons, priests, and bishops. However, in the earliest church, there were no priests. There were only 2 sacred orders. There were bishops and there were deacons. So a lot of what, and deacons, the ministry of deacon is pretty similar to what it is today. What can a deacon do in the liturgy?
Pretty much
Give out
everything.
community.
Yeah, can't celebrate communion.
Can't
Can read from the
translate
gospel by tradition, you know, can give the dismissal at the end,
Set the
can
table.
set the table and distribute communion.
and serve the reserve sacrament.
Right. Just can't celebrate.
Yeah, can't solve it.
Yeah. All right. And so, you see, when you're talking about a smaller collection of worshipers, then it makes sense. You have the bishop who comes and essentially presides over the congregation, and the deacons who go out and take the sacrament to those who cannot be present and help to serve it to those who are. But as the church got bigger and bigger and bigger, got more complicated, you need to have a different kind of somebody to vicariously exercise the bishop's authority. And that's when the order of priests started to develop and, of course, took over. So, well, there are more priests. There are more priests. Well, it's kind of like,
Crowd says what?
Oh, it says in the prayer book when the bishop is present, otherwise.
right, exactly, yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's like, well, in the contemporary U.S. military, they have pay grades, right? Well, and it's known as the E3 Mafia in all 4 branches or 5 branches of the service. And those are essentially when the Marine Corps, it's the Lance Corporals. Half the Marine Corps is made up of Lance Corporals. And when half of it is Lance Corporals, you can be a general. It doesn't matter. You have to convince them to do it. And so that's why they kind of run everything by their expectations and ability to perform. It was the same way with priests. But this is before priests. And the whole role of bishop, and again, this is important with Mark and Alexandria and all that grew out of this gospel, the whole role of bishops was to educate. And so the bishop's chair that we're familiar with, that the bishop will take next time he or she shows up, was where the sermon, which was actually known as the instruction, that's from where it was delivered. And so that would be center. The bishop would sit in the chair, and the bishop would deliver instruction about, to help understand and unlock scriptural knowledge. How wonderful if your bishop also happens to be the author of the Gospel of Mark. So you get a lot. You should look at the development of Alexandria as a school of thought in early Christianity. You go back to the simplicity and the directness and of the Gospel of Mark, but in particular too, I always think the kind of incarnational aspect. Jesus is maybe, we can argue this one,
Okay.
Jesus is maybe at his most human in Mark. There are portions in Luke certainly that are literate and stylistic, but there's a lot of, okay, this is what Jesus is doing, A, B, C, this is what it's about. And how does the Gospel of Mark end?
Abruptly. And the other ending.
The other ending. The tacked on ending.
Tacked on.
Here's the ending of the Gospel of Mark in its original. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath, so as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate, and he did, and asked for Jesus' body. And Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, made the print as small as possible, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid.
And that's it. No resurrection.
That's the end of the Gospel of Mark. Whoa. That's shaky. The earliest manuscripts do not have chapter 16 in them. Somewhere along the line, and I don't know from where. Do you recall?
No, because it's all theory anyway.
Exactly, it's all guesswork. A portion of Q, an awareness that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke were telling resurrection and pretty vivid resurrection tales, and this needed that. The interesting thing is the earliest church then, from the Gospel of Mark, didn't need stories of the resurrection.
Because they were living it.
Yeah, exactly. He was coming back, and they all knew it. They all knew about the resurrection. They didn't have to, this was the stuff they didn't know about. But what's interesting too is if this is being taken from the teachings of Peter, that means Peter didn't necessarily find the resurrection more important than living its meaning. Right? Incarnational means emphasis on the human aspect of Jesus, right? Which is why Christmas is the Feast of the Incarnation, for example. That's what makes Jesus so special as a deity of sorts in the ancient world, because he is weak, he is literally an infantile. He bleeds, right? He is wounded. He is sometimes, he does die. He is the God who bleeds, which is what the Babylonians referred to him as. And how the Romans first picked up on his importance, the God who bleeds. Well, we have one of those. He's called Augustus. So they added the resurrection, which goes from when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices, and we know, and they found the stone is rolled away, and there is, oh God, one of those angels.
That strange guy.
A young man in a white robe. I almost said a white man in a young robe. Sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed, and he said what angels always say, don't be alarmed, or don't be afraid, or cool it. It's cool. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, the Nazarene who was crucified. What translation is this? He is risen, he is not here, see the place where they laid him, etc. Okay?
So who added that?
No,
We don't know.
don't know.
It was added.
Yeah, not Q,
No.
just smart.
Yeah.
They use N.
It would have been,
Or R.
yeah, R maybe, I don't know. What
Yeah, right.
somehow it was added by the School of Alexandria.
No.
And again, to bring it maybe into accord. People, the longer it took for the return, the more they needed to think about resurrection, instead of just, okay, he's coming. We'll understand it all. But that's what's interesting about Mark. So that's Mark. Mark's the oldest then, right? And probably taken from that. Mark was one of the 70. Then we have Matthew, obviously, of whom we have spoken. I can't think I can really add anything to Matthew other than what we've already said. No, other than some of the phrasing, it's kind of interesting. It's obvious that there are a few examples where it's obvious that the original story was told in Hebrew and it was translated into Greek because syntactically it's a little off. Imagine if you spoke French and you tried to literally translate it into English. This would be, the jacket of me, right? Not my jacket. So there's some little things like that we kind of lose in the English translation. So, in fact, there's a fascinating difference in English translation between what's actually stated and what we nowadays hear in this Sunday's gospel that we were just talking about in our clergy thing this week, that our little group noticed as we were concentrating on the gospel, the 5 of us, or 6 of us, or however many it was. All righty, thank God for smartphones. Luke, what do we know about Luke?
Doctor.
Physician, right? You gotta be careful. In the ancient world, doctor could also mean a kind of scholar. Like it can today, I guess, but yeah.
Like a PhD.
Yeah. There were those early doctors of the church. There still are doctors of the church. They're official ones, though. And mostly in Roman Catholicism. But he was a physician. From where? Now we're about to go into really wild territory. There are some, especially in the Eastern Church, who speculate he may have been the brother to either Barnabas, we're familiar with Barnabas, right? Barnabas the encourager, or Paul.
Oh, wow.
And that's why he writes
So much about Acts.
about cats.
For the Gentiles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing. His audience was very different, certainly different than Mark. Mark was writing for Jews, right? Okay. Matthew, kind of the expatriate Jews, let's say. Luke, he had a real voice. Well, it was kind of mixed. There's been a lot of argument. Was it for the Gentiles or was it for a mixed group? I think probably, maybe this is just a safe guess, probably a mixed group of Gentiles and Jews. But nevertheless, there were Gentiles who had to be thought of in this so that, who didn't have the same background as the Jews and weren't as familiar with some of the prophecy and some of the works of the patriarchs and things like that. So we've got Luke. There's an interesting thing that occurs, though, in particular. First off, all right, there's speculation. It's pretty well known, or thought anyway, and we cannot know any of this absolutely. He was a physician, probably from Antioch. Well, now that's interesting, isn't it? So we've got Mark setting up what will become the school of Alexandria, and we have Luke, by extension, kind of setting up the foundation for what will become the school of Antioch. It is also supposed he may have been a Grecian Jew. Who knows? It seems fairly obvious either he was really a talented writer, well, he was a talented writer, a really talented linguist, or his first language was Greek. Because the Greek he writes in is fluid. He also, in the Gospel of Luke and Luke Acts, the broadest range of vocabulary is found, of the 4, is found in Luke. So more words, more different words are in Luke than in the others. He uses a lot of words, that feller. Generally, it's accepted nowadays that he was a non-Jew writing for a non-Jewish audience, but again, like I said, it was probably a mixed audience, but it's likely he was not a Jew himself. He was, however, this makes it interesting, he was, however, one of the 70. Yeah. So that makes it sort of interesting, too. And then there's another little curiosity, and you find this, and this is why I was particular about including Acts of the Apostles in here, because again, it really was intended to be one whole work. Now, if you ever have a chance, if you like reading the Bible, maybe it's Lent, maybe you're waiting for your wife to finish at the nursery, or at the garden center, or something like that, and you have time to read the entire Gospel of Acts of the Apostles. Bible. Yeah, well, actually, pretty much the entire Bible. Yeah. There's something read it all, experience it all as one total work. It's kind of interesting. There's something in Acts which is really interesting, and that's the change in pronoun. That's a change in tense. Because for a portion of Acts, Luke writes describing the experiences of others, and then suddenly at a particular point, he starts saying we. And that proceeds for a while. And then he stops saying we, and he starts using they again, which would indicate what? For at least that portion of the story, Luke was a direct participant. And see, that's kind of an interesting thing. Matthew, one can argue, if we're right about Matthew, he was a direct participant in the earliest ministry of Jesus because he was one of the 12. John Mark was not. Mark of the Gospel, Mark the Evangelist was not. Luke was not. But he was a one who directly experienced that which was the extended ministry of the 70, and then, at least in portions. So if you read Acts, I hope I put it down here. All right, if you're reading Acts, Paul has that mission to, Troas, which is in modern-day Turkey. It includes the area which included the city-state of Troy. Right? And remember, Troy was thought to be mythical up until the late 19th century, which we talked about in biblical archaeology. Anyway, once Paul's mission goes to that area, modern-day Turkey, that's suddenly when Acts of the Apostles becomes first person. And continues that way until after the mission to Philippi, when it once again becomes third person. So that would indicate Luke had a direct participation, at least in that portion of it. And he is very precise with his language. He's one of those very, very careful writers. You can tell because, not just lyrically. For example, where do we get the lush story of the incarnation that we read every Christmas? But in particular, his usage, his balance of language, these are things you can pick up in English too, which is a real testimony to how talented he was. All these things, the way he built scenes in a particular way, linguistically, to reveal something, and then steps away from it rather nicely. It's very interesting. Anyway, that's indicates that he had some sort of direct participation, some sort of personal involvement, at least in part of it. So right now we've got two members of the 70, one of the 12, and then the greatest mystery of all.
The wild card.
Yeah, first off, the name John, really? Come on. There were a lot of Jesuses running around in the first century too, but oh my goodness, the name John, which is, what is it now? The second most common name in the Western world? Currently the first most common is, do we know? Muhammad.
I thought it was Brittany.
Yeah.
That seems that way.
Yeah.
It's Brianna.
Tiffany.
Yeah. Yeah, so John's common. So who is John? Now, how many Johns do we have in the New Testament? Yeah, we have lots of Johns. Yeah. Yes, unlike the
Mary.
Oh yeah.
Mary's Mary.
Oh yeah. John and Mary. That's okay. So we have obviously John, the brother of James, right? Okay, and then we have John, who wrote the 3 epistles of John, right? And then we have John of Patmos, who wrote the Revelation, right? The Revelation of John. And then we have this other shady character who floats around, not in Scripture, but floats around early Christian history, known as John the Presbyter. You ever hear of him?
Is that John the Baptist?
Oh, no, thank you for pointing out. Yeah, we have that other John. And thank heaven he was beheaded by this time, so we wouldn't have him considering the list of, he was gone. Yeah. He was bisected by that point. Bifurcated. With extreme prejudice. Yeah, no, John the Presbyter is this mysterious fellow who sort of floats around. The word presbyter is very interesting, though. The word presbyter is kind of interesting because it is still in use in the Christian church, except it has morphed into the word priest. John the Presbyter, who may or may not have been the author of the Gospel of John. Or it could have been John, who is the apostle. Or maybe John, who was or is the apostle, got exiled in later life to the island of Patmos, known primarily as the place that supplied the hallucinogenic mushrooms for the Delphic oracles, right? Jeez.
What fun.
That explains a lot about the language in a way. Yeah, that was the literary style of the island, apparently.
Is that circa the 60s and 70s?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's later.
No, but it's interesting because you can look at, like Ken Kesey. Read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, again, if you have a chance. And again, if you're waiting at a garden center. You'll
I
have
have
a chance.
mushrooms.
Right.
No, I mean, it was during the time when he was experimenting with LSD. And so you will see a lot of hallucinogenic imagery in for a book that was written in 1962, a lot of hallucinogenic imagery built into it just because of his experiments in mind expansion. Or just getting slacked, which is what it really kind of came down to. But anyway, so we've got all these suspects for John, but we do know, how does John identify John in the Gospel of John?
The one whom Jesus loved.
The one whom Jesus loved. Yeah. Why did he just say me, I, John? Good old John? I don't know.
He was disassociative.
John, the brother of James? John, one half of the Boanerges? The Boanerges. You know about that? Oh, John and James, they were called the sons of thunder. That's what that means.
Oh.
Apparently because they were like as Jenny knows, the Clifford brothers. They were the Clifford brothers of the first century. Yeah. Brothers who could not get together without getting into a yelling fight with one
No,
another.
there was some other brother.
Oh.
Yeah, it's the Smothers brothers. Yes, the Clifford brothers of the first century, the sons of thunder. So, I mentioned earlier the reign of the rather brief reign of Harold Agrippa the First, where Peter was almost executed. James was apparently executed at that point. Yeah. And Peter manages to escape, and that's when he meets Mark. Yeah. All right. So we have all these suspects. We just know him as the beloved disciple. Why?
Found out the usual stuff.
Yeah. Why not use his name, though? Was that a convention of the time?
I thought he was just kind of full of himself because he's like the one Jesus loved. Instead of
After all,
the other guys.
he
They were
gave his
like,
mother to me.
Or the opposite.
My mother's favorite.
Too modest to name himself.
himself.
You know, I mean.
Yeah.
Or let's think about it this way:
Jesus loved them all, though.
He
is
said he did.
who called him that? Would John refer to himself as that, or would those who loved John refer to him as such?
Well, it could be either one.
You know, I'm beginning to realize old teachers have an interesting power over men who are not even young anymore. I figured that out a couple of Sundays ago.
Has it stuck?
When you have, 46-year-old men show up who haven't seen you in 30 years just to visit their old teacher, it was kind of like, oh, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Now here's John, he's got his community, the community of the beloved disciple, as they are known, and he is elderly, and he is probably failing, not unlike me. So anyway, and he is, and they're becoming aware that if he was in fact John, who was one of the 12, then the last tangible connection they have is leaving, and they love him all the more because he's created a community that is taking them now just to the verge of the second century, into the second century of Christianity. There's a lot of supposition. Odds are, while it was not John the Apostle who directly wrote the Gospel of John, it was a collection of the things that he had taught to his community and was put together, edited together rather nicely to create this kind of new type of gospel that really did kind of serve as that which bridges first century Christianity with second century Christianity, and all in his honor. Because in those days you tended not, if you wrote something, if you created some work of art, you just didn't put your name on it. It just wasn't normal to do so. You might put your patron's name on it. For example, the nostalgic favorite for translations of the Holy Bible is not called the Lancelot Andrews version.
Right.
right?
Right.
Yeah, although he was responsible for the committee and the translator and the bulk of the translation. It's called the King James Version. King James probably could barely put together a paragraph, but no, that's harsh. He had a good education. Actually, his love letters, well, never mind, we'll wait till the time. His love letters to his male lover were remarkably florid and showed a kind of interesting hint of the poet in him. The letters he wrote to his wife were, wow, rather dull. All right, so we have this sort of, it's sort of a love letter. It's sort of a love letter to John. And they put it together, and here it is. Our the father of our folks. He did have one direct. I don't think we've ever spoken of him. Did you ever hear of Polycarp? Yeah, very early church father, as they're called. One of the patristical leaders of the church. He was martyred, and he was in his 80s. He was martyred rather spectacularly. He was burned at the stake as his bodily fluids boiled and his flesh gushed open. Yeah, doves flew from his soon-to-be carcass. It's one of the more lurid, popular tales. Well, that's the thing. He was asked to recant, and he said, "I'm 82 years old. I've been a Christian my whole life." Polycarp may have been one of the children who sat on Jesus' knee when he said, "Suffer the children to come unto me." So that's how Polycarp was the devoted disciple of John. So you get a sense of the devotion of his subsequent
Yeah, I
pupils.
think we talked about Polycarp in one of those Lent.
I hope so, yeah, yeah.
That sounds familiar.
Because those early church
Yes,
guys,
to recant.
yeah, it's like the second generation of people that we don't, whose names aren't as familiar, but did have a really kind of holy witness and carried it on, and suffered mightily through persecutions, too. A lot of them were martyred. Anyway, that's what we have with John. So, and the one thing then, too, is, if you go to the 21st chapter of John, the 24th verse, or getting near the end of it, it says, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true." So maybe there was some written source or a collection of written sources. Who was it? I remember Donald Westlake, who wrote the Dortmunder books and the Parker books. He was a writer of thrillers. He was a very prolific writer of thrillers. We sat next to him in a restaurant in Great Barrington or in the Berkshires one time. Anyway, if you've ever read these books, they're fun. Yeah, Parker is an amoral criminal, and those books grew out of the noir movement,
Yeah.
And somewhere along the line, around 1970, as our culture was getting a little lighter, he was writing a Parker, and it kept getting funny. He couldn't prevent it from being a funny book. And the Parker books are very stark. So he changed the character to, Dortmunder.
John
Dortmunder, who is this kind of hapless, middle-class crook, and his gang of supporters.
Brilliant.
Oh, yeah.
Brilliant strategist.
But-
He planned.
Right.
He was the planner.
Right, and how I got onto this, I can't remember now, except that, about prolific writings of what can happen. When Westlake died, his wife was going through his office, and on his desk was a half-written James Bond novel. So, it's kind of interesting that the way that, I've forgotten now how many, since Ian Fleming died 50 years ago, or 60, how many James Bond novels have been written by other writers who have just carried it forward. It's sort of like collated, and in appreciation of what was created, we add to it the things we know or the things that we have learned ourselves. And the Gospel of John is kind of this glorious, wonderful, massive work of theology, really, which creates that foundation. It's very different from the other Gospels, and we tend to only read it at certain times of year, particularly Easter season. Easter season's interesting. We read the Acts of the Apostles instead of the Old Testament and the what, honey?
Christmas Day.
Christmas Day. Oh, yeah. That's the one we don't always hear. Because it's not Christmas. Christmas Eve, we do Luke. Christmas Day, we do that really interesting reading from John for the two people who show up. Yeah. And so that serves as the bridge then between the first century and the second. And so all that comes together. So it is likely, if not directly written by John the Apostle, it was certainly inspired by his teaching, and it was an act of love of his community towards what he provided for them.
One of the great American scholars of the 20th century, a guy named Raymond Brown, kind of blew the exegetical world off their rocker by a couple of works that he wrote. One titled "The Community of the Beloved Disciple,"
Right.
and he kind of uses both historical, critical information from the Gospel of John and contemporaneous works to describe what that community was like. And it just...
It's worth reading.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still in print. I imagine it is.
Yeah, probably.
If not, you can find used copies because it used to be a standard assigned book.
Mhm.
So that means they're sitting around
But the
remaining.
importance of the community
Right.
is what was raised up. And
Mhm.
how communities develop a kind of ethos, their own particular ethos and culture and stories,
Right.
the stories that are important to them.
That's why you can take the four Gospels, and since a community produced all four, you can see the things that they valued and the things that they didn't, and the
So
their
to
worldview.
say that they are writing for a particular community is significant.
Mhm.
It's who's hearing this and,
Yeah.
and what would have been important to them.
And that's what makes John particularly, it makes John different, because it was writing now for an ever-expanding community. It was being presented to a community not yet known.
Right.
So that could be then become part of their documentation, which is why there's that really, really strong theological element in the beginning that is designed for anyone from any background. It's not just Jews, it's not just even those familiar with, Greek philosophy, the Greek cosmology. It's, okay, here is how union between divine and human came to be, and how it exists, and what it did, and how it's known.
It's the John prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and
Yeah.
the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yes, logos.
Mhm.
And there we have it.
Amen.